When you're ready.
Hey everyone, and welcome to our first live Q&A for National Quilter Circle for the new year. So welcome, Colleen. Thanks for being back with us this year. How's your new year going so far?
So far, very active. Lots going on. Lots with family, lots with quilting, lots with live events. It's a bang up year so far. Let's keep it going.
Perfect. So I know I caught a little live that you had done earlier, and you did talk about some maybe, New Year's resolutions with quilting or things that you want to either do or try, or can you share just a couple of what those are and maybe some suggestions for people who also are trying to do a quilting New Year's resolution?
Oh yes, definitely.
Okay.
The biggest thing for us was not to go too big too fast, and so set some goals and actually write them down. Because if they stare back at you, you tend to think, oh, yeah, I need to do that. It reminds you. So these are in my sewing room, literally right beside my pincushion. So my goal was to make sure that just a skill that I wanted to work on was getting up and pressing in between sewing. So literally get out of my chair and move, because it's good for us to get instead of sit there for hours. Another one was a habit. And that is to clean up this mess at least once a month, because it's more fun to make a mess in a clean space.
It's true. A new mess.
Yes, exactly. And then to pick one project that you want to get done maybe in the next 6 months or so. And yes, that Snowman Quilt is sitting near my long arm. He needs to jump onto it to get finished. And then I got to find some binding, because he's been around for about 10 years and he hasn't melted yet, but he needs to get finished. Yeah.
Gotcha. Well, yeah, I feel like you got plenty of time before this Christmas to get him done.
That's
Perfect. Perfect. Awesome. I like the cleaning up one. I don't necessarily clean up every month, but I have to. It's like a thing. After I finish a project, I have to clean up before I can start the next one. It's just, so that's the way that one has to work. But a great question to go into now. I'm new to quilting. Where do I begin?
When I was a new quilter, the biggest thing that I found that was of value to me was to read everything I could find. So things have changed a little in 15 to 20 years. So maybe it's, those YouTube videos that give you good tips on cutting, how to select fabrics, the terminology, is to gather as many tools into your toolbox as possible, because that will make reading a pattern and selecting fabrics and getting going with the cutting and the sewing a lot smoother process if you understand what you're reading. So patterns can almost seem like foreign when you open them at first if you're not used to the terminology we use. We use acronyms sometimes and abbreviations that can be a little daunting to the new quilter. So if you're not familiar with your sewing machine, that's something to just sit down and practice sewing and manipulating the fabric or even paper at first without thread in the machine, to get used to the foot pedal and the speed and the different kinds of stitches on your machine. So know that, and then get into the tools and things. As a new quilter, it's really a good thing to maybe, if you can, shop in a quilt shop that has some really good resource people there to speak with. I get a lot of times people asking, what are some of the basic tools I need to start? Because they can be quite expensive to get started. But there are some very basic midline kinds of tools, and you can always upgrade later, but that will help you get your cutting down, the control on the machine by just playing on the machine, and don't worry about it being perfect at first, but manipulating the fabric and understanding what a 1/4 inch seam looks like. A real 1/4 inch seam. Don't just fake it. And once you get those, then that helps. But gain as much knowledge as you can. If it's reading blogs or watching YouTube videos of people talking about what does a 1/4 inch seam really look like, those are good places to start.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely agree with the purchasing of the tools, because it can, especially if you are looking at someone who's been quilting for a number of years and the number of things that we've accumulated over the years, like you don't have to have all that. Technically, a sewing machine, one rotary cutter, a cutting mat, and technically one ruler, it's easier with a couple, but you can get by with, just a few things. So don't think you have to run out and get everything either. So yeah, some help at a quilt shop is always a welcomed thing. Our next one here, Janie says, I am self-taught but want to learn the correct way to quilt.
Loaded question. Is there a correct way to quilt? I'm self-taught also. I came to quilting from a garment construction background and a home economics degree. So quilting was a little bit different for me. So I had to find that 1/4 inch seam, getting it really consistent. If you can take any classes, if you can view any instruction online, those are really great ways to maybe pick up some skills that you want to hone, that some would say the correct way, some would say it's a way, because there are people who, for instance, press all their seams to one side. There are a whole nother group of people who prefer to press their seams open. Neither one is wrong. Neither one is actually right. It's what you feel comfortable with. So that's why I think the quilt community is such a welcoming community, because there are a lot of different ways to get to the same end result. It takes finding what you as a quilter feel comfortable doing and have the success with. And then that leads to that chain of projects. I want to make that. I want to make that. I want to do this. I want to try that skill. I want to buy that tool. And it takes you on the journey. So don't worry maybe so much about the correct way, but what gets you to the success and the level of finished that on a project that you are comfortable with.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially when it comes to seams, like look at all the quilts behind you, the quilt behind me. Nobody knows which way we pressed any of those seams. Like you'll never know. You can't see them.
Exactly.
All right. Diana asks, she's new also. When and why do you bury knots?
Burying knots usually refers to the machine quilting process, because when we're piecing, we don't backstitch, we don't tie knots, because usually every seam is crossed with another seam, so we don't need to worry about knots or backstitching there. When we talk about burying knots, we're usually talking about the machine quilting process, when we've sandwiched the back, the batting, and the top together, and we're stitching through it. Now, to bury a seam, I tend to be kind of a fudger on that one. I tend to draw the bottom thread to the top and then stitch in place 2 or 3 stitches and then begin my machine quilting, which then kind of buries those tips and I can snip the thread off. If you're worried about that pulling out at all, then you take those 2 threads, the top thread and the bottom thread, put them through the eye of a needle and pull them down, take them back down into the batting layer at the exact same spot that it came through the quilt top itself. Or you can take them all the way to the back and do the same thing if you're worried about show through. So maybe it's a lighter quilt and you were quilting in an area that was really dark and you were using black thread. You want to maybe make sure that it gets pulled through into an area that it's not going to show through in the front of the quilt. So a lot of times that's where people will hide, is you can do it from the top or the bottom, either one. But so about when you do it, it's if you know that quilt also is going to be washed a lot. Maybe it's a baby quilt or a quilt that's going to go to someone as a lap quilt in a nursing home or a care facility where it may be laundered a lot and thrown in with things. You may want to bury those threads because the laundering process can be a lot of tug and pull on those quilting areas. And the same thing with hand quilting is to take it down back into the batting layer, swing that thread down into the batting, and then come back up and snip threads so that the tails are within the quilt and not on the top or the back.
Absolutely. And if you're wondering, wanting to know how to do that little cheat method you said at the beginning, we do have a video on National Quilter Circle on how to tie off to begin your machine quilting. Another instructor did that. So always check that out too. So, perfect. All right. Laura wants to know, how do you determine a beginner quilt pattern versus something more advanced?
Okay. So when you're looking at a quilt project, look at how many seams are within the quilt block itself, not the entire quilt, but the quilt block. Isolate the portions of the quilt you're going to be making and figure out how many seams are in there. The more seams, usually the more complex a quilt block becomes. If you're trying to start as a beginner, look for things that have squares and rectangles. because that means there aren't any bias edges or bias stretches. So maybe leave triangles down the line, just a few couple of quilts in maybe to jump into those next. So use the angle, a triangle as an indicator, and the number of seams within a block to help you decipher, is this a beginner block, is it a really simple block, or is it more of an intermediate or even an advanced block?
Absolutely. And speaking of just some great beginner quilt patterns, as well as intermediate, we do have a link, should be on the banner on the page that you are watching this video on, that you can click on, and that takes you to the free patterns page on National Quilter Circle, and there is a bunch of different free patterns that you can pick from, and those are all download free. Try them out. Some are beginner, some are a little harder, but use what she just explained to be able to determine if it's something that you think is within your current level. Next question here, how hard is it to learn free motion quilting on your own sewing machine at home?
That's another loaded question, but a very good question, because a lot of us want to finish our own quilts. We want to be the person who started from the cutting through the piecing, the layering, and the actual quilting of the quilt and the binding, and say we did the entire thing ourselves. Now, patience is going to be key. If you're wanting to learn machine quilting, there are some great videos. There are great videos here at National Quilter Circle that can get you started on machine quilting. Things to know about dropping feed dogs, about what kind of foot to have on your machine, what stitch length you should try to maintain during the process. There are even products that you can put over the bed of your sewing machine to make, like what's called a slider or something similar to it, to make it more slick so that your quilt sandwich will slide more easily under the presser foot. It also depends on if you want to do straight line quilting, which you would use a walking foot for, or if you're going to be using a free motion foot, looks more like a hopper foot, looks very different than any of the feet that we use when we're piecing. So you need to kind of determine if you want to do straight lines, if you want to do just that free motion. Free motion is going to take some time. It's going to take some practice. And so I remember tearing out so much quilting that was ridiculous. I should have just left it and kept going. But practice things to work on. Make yourself new hot pads for the kitchen and machine quilt them. Because if they don't turn out perfect and they end up with spaghetti sauce on them, it won't matter. The other thing is, I used to make a quilt sandwich to practice on over and over, and it was about a 15-inch square of fabric. Try to use something that's semi-solid, something that's not too busy, so you can actually see the stitching on there as you work. And yes, you will have elbows where your stitching maybe doesn't make a perfect curve, but kind of jots around. Means slow down your hands or speed up the needle, whichever it is, it's your issue. But use that sandwich more than once. You can put in, say, a pale pink thread and stitch and work on the whole piece and say, well, now I'm done. I have to make, I need to practice again. I need another quilt sandwich. No, put in dark red and use the same sandwich over again, because this is just practice. You don't need to waste another piece of fabric. It's the stitching line that you're looking at, not the finished content of the quilt. So that stitching line will become very evident where you're stitching. And once you're done with it, take it out and go again. Pick black or a bright green. Use up those threads that you have in your drawer and that you maybe aren't going to use for quilting on anything else, and practice some more. Quilting gloves can help. They look something like, let's see if I can get mine out of my drawer here. There are different brands of machine quilting gloves that you can use to help, that have kind of a grip on the inside. There are white ones that have grip on the fingers that can help you not have a death grip on your fabric, but that help you slowly move it under your machine. There are a lot of different little tricks out there. So search through the YouTube videos. It's patterning your brain is what it is. None of us in about third grade picked up a pen and wrote our name in cursive instantly perfect. It just didn't happen. It took us time and time practicing it over and over until it became smooth and repetitive and almost something you can do with your eyes closed. So machine quilting is going to be the same thing. Doodle a lot. When you're sitting in front of the TV, when you're riding in the car, not driving, but riding in the car, doodle on old tablet paper, on a dry erase tablet, something.
Mm-hmm.
It can even be doodle on your iPad on draw. You can use your finger and doodle. The idea is to pattern your brain into the design that you're looking for so that you can put that onto fabric. So
Absolutely.
Practice and enjoy.
Yes. Perfect. All right. Sandra here has a comment, and she just says that she's a beginner and that she reads, watches YouTube, and has friended wonderful, experienced quilters. What a blessing. And also great local quilt shops have been amazing as well. So all of the things that you were saying earlier too. So perfect. All right, our next one here. Speaking of tools, what templates are the best to buy at the start? In other words, what ruler sizes and templates are most important? Seems like every video uses different ones.
Yes, and they all are promoting different companies, and there are a lot of good companies out there. And usually most of them carry these specific rulers. So I like to have an 8.5 by 24.5. That's a long, wide ruler, because then I can cut strips really nicely across a width of fabric that's folded. So the selvages are on top of each other, the fold on the opposite, and I cut nice strips across, because a lot of the cutting in quilts is done from strips and then subcut into shapes. So an 8.5 by 24 is an excellent tool. Every quilter needs one of those, I think, in their cache of tools. The other two would be an option. I like a 6.5 square or a 12.5 square, because that will allow you to easily, probably the 12.5 square first, because you can cut just about any size square that most patterns are going to use. A 6.5 square is just a little easier to manipulate. So that's the third one on the list to acquire. Now, when it comes to brands, there are a lot of brands. I am a fan of Quilter Select. I am a fan of Creative Grids, and I'm a fan of the Omni rulers. So there really isn't one. It kind of depends on what's available to you in the quilt shops in your area, because trying to mail an 8.5 by 24.5 puts it in jeopardy of it arriving with dinged corners.
Or just broken in half.
Oh yeah, just snapped in half. Exactly. I don't think the Amazon guy really understands what it's for.
No.
Love him dearly, but that big box, it's going to be floating around in there, and it may not arrive in one piece. So a local place that you can go, even if it's curbside, that you can call them and do curbside pickup for that kind of a ruler. Those are the three that I would definitely go to first. Now, if you are a quilter who has any issues with dexterity or holding a ruler down in place, because it happens for all of us eventually, and it can happen at the very beginning. So don't be intimidated if you find one that it slips and you want to replace. Quilter Select has a great product. A finish on the back of their rulers that really holds them in place. You literally have to be able to pick it up to even adjust. It does not shift on the fabric. Creative Grids has built-in little dots on theirs, which really does help with some of the shift. And even the other brands that are out there, like OmniGrid, has ones that have a non-skid type of surface on the back. So it kind of comes down to what your needs are, but look at those as tools that you want to get.
So I definitely agree on the brands. I'm always a fan of the Omni Grip, which is the part of the Omni Grid. What's funny, I don't have a single one of those sizes of rulers.
Oh, really?
I don't, which I was.
What are your favorites?
I know, but I did. So my favorite is the 24. Also, I definitely think one that is the width of 24 is super important, but mine's the 6. So, and I used to also have a 6.5. So just definitely the 24-inch length. And then I have a 5-inch square ruler and a 3.5, because generally, and I use those more for squaring up half square triangles, like smaller pieces, and one that you can put your hand over and have like one of your fingers, whether it's the thumb or the pinky, off, like helps you keep it. But I just thought it was funny that I don't have a single one that, that you recommended size, except for 24 in length. You definitely need one of those. Yeah, that would be the first number one I'd say to go buy for sure.
I started with a shorter one. Don't do that.
No, because I tried too. Like then you try to fold the fabric to get it, and you end up with weird elbows. It's just not worth it.
No,
for sure. At least we agree on one thing. All right, our next one here, Bonnie says, does one always start quilting from the middle out? Also, should I do a 1/8 inch stitch around the edges before starting, like a basting or something?
Oh, okay. So when you're machine quilting, yes, starting from the center is a good thing if you're doing it on your domestic machine, so that you can kind of ensure that you don't get a wrinkle or a shifting of everything to one direction. So starting in a center, working to an outer edge, then going back to the center and working to the outer edge, center to the top, center to the bottom. Yes, that is an ideal way to do your machine quilting. 1/8 of an inch stitch from the outer edge before you start. If you're talking about just stitching into the quilt top itself, it can be done if you have bias edges on the outside edge of your quilt. If when you get done, you look and realize that you have setting triangles in the outer edge that happen to have a bias edge there, that will help it from being distorted as you handle it. Or if you're even taking it to a long armor. If at all you're cutting and you have that bias edge on the outside edge, that's a good thing to do. It helps the long armor keep everything square. It keeps you even honest in your own sewing room if you're doing machine quilting on your domestic machine. It's not required if you're using, if you're putting borders on your quilt that are straight of grain, or even a pieced one that still has straight of grain edges on the outside edge. It's not required. It's kind of a personal choice whether or not you feel that, you're going to have, if you have seams that pop on the outside edge of your quilt, which sometimes does happen, and it can happen in a pieced outer border, but sometimes the reason why it's happening is your stitch length is a little bit long. So double check your stitch length on your machine for when you're piecing, because that will help avoid those popped edges on the outside edge of your quilt.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I would say that's the only time I ever do a back stitch is like if I know the seam is going to be on the end, or even like on a quilt like this one where it's just border strips, I will even do a back stitch just on the borders, just on what is on the outside edge.
Yeah, part that they may actually tug on a little bit, you don't want to come apart.
Exactly. All right, our next question here, how do you avoid scrunching when machine sewing?
Scrunching.
I'm going to say scrunching, or maybe like fabric bunching, or just things not laying flat.
Okay. That comes down to, are you pushing the fabric into the machine, or are you letting the machine do the work? Maybe. Because I think about it as like when I lay things down to put them under the presser foot and to make my seam, make sure everything's laying flat as you start. If you're working on maybe putting borders on your finished quilt, you're going to have a big piece. And that means a start and stop process to make sure that everything is laying flat underneath, that the bottom edge hasn't kind of faded away to one edge. You always want to keep your cut edges, right on top of each other. So be patient. I think when you get to the point where if things are bunching up or wrinkling, it's because you're trying to maybe go too fast at the process. So be patient. Remember to breathe. You'll get to the end of the seam. It'll be fine. But start with everything flat, laying right on top, one piece on top of each other, and let the machine do the work. Don't try to push it through either, because sometimes you can get bunching if you're trying to go too quickly through it and you're pushing it through the machine. The other thing is, if you have bunching or seams, maybe you need to resort to a few pins once in a while to keep those seams one on top of the other, because it's happened to all of us as we're putting pieces together where the bottom kind of fades away underneath there, and then we pick it up and we've missed the edge completely, or we've got a little hole in our quilt because one edge dropped and it's not in the 1/4 inch seam like it's supposed to. So patience, remember to breathe, and it's a journey. It's not a marathon race.
Absolutely. All right. Our next one here, Nazia says that she has trouble matching colors. Does it really matter what colors to put with other colors sometimes, or what would be some tips on how to select good colors for quilts?
Oh, okay. Everyone sees color differently. The color receptors in our eyes are unique to us. So, what matches sometimes for one person may not be a match to you. I know when I'm assisting quilters, sometimes in the shop where I work, over the years, I've had people say, well, that's not green, that's brown. And so to them, the color that they see is different than what I see, which is not wrong. It's because if you're going to be the one enjoying the quilt, you should see the color the way be able to interpret it your direction. One thing that does help is that if you pick a selection of fabrics to work with and you want to see if they're going to go together, it looks like I froze temporarily. Look on the edge, the selvage edge of the fabric, and look for the dots of different colors that were used maybe to create that fabric. So, especially if it's a multicolor or a floral, a pattern, it will give you hints to other fabrics or other colors to use in that project. Also, think of the color wheel, the things you learned in art class in school. What colors are adjacent to each other? What colors are opposite each other? So you can do a little study on color to help you think, okay, so if I want to make a blue quilt, what kind of accents would I maybe select? And if you pick red and white, it's going to look more patriotic. If you pick a yellow, it'll be a more classic look to it. And yellow is one of those primary colors. So they go together. If you want a strong contrast, go across the color wheel to orange. So color is a personal thing. It's really in the eye of the beholder, literally, how they see color. And, we look at quilts and say, ooh, that's gorgeous. But then there are art quilts that can contain everything, and they're gorgeous too. So it takes time, though. Don't think that you can quickly walk in and coordinate a quilt in 20 minutes. It sometimes is a lot of work.
Well, and especially like not only people see colors differently, but you have things that you associate certain colors with. Like someone might look at a green and yellow and think springtime, and I think the Packers. Like you have a different thing that you associate them with, so you might like something for a different reason, So whatever you want for colors. But I will say, if you want more information on colors and color theories, we have a lot of great videos on National Quilter Circle and even a complete class on color. And it does even come with a color wheel that you can have, to get you everything you need to know about color and matching color and coordinating and everything.
Right.
All right, our next one. I have an older quilt with a frayed scalloped edge. Is there any way to repair it?
And I've worked on ones like this. It's a tough question. It depends on if you want to be using that quilt. You may need to actually take the binding off and replace the binding. If you are your goal is just to preserve that quilt, is to keep it as is and don't mess with it. So it kind of depends on if you want to use it or you want to preserve it. Mm-hmm. Now, if you want to use it, the challenge is going to be finding fabric that either coordinates or matches or it comes as close as possible to the fabrics used in the original quilt. And sometimes like scalloped edge makes me think that maybe it's the 1930s or a floral quilt. So matching the color may be the challenge. And trying to match that right now online, you're going to order a lot of pieces before you find the right one.
Yeah.
Colors change over time. It's amazing when you think, oh, it has a yellow in it. I can match a yellow, and you walk in the shop or you go online and yellow ranges from a real pale yellow to a mustard to a lemon to this creamy buttery yellow. You really have to have it in person to match in order to replace binding and put a new one on. But it can be done. It's going to take some time. If it's a scalloped one, it's going to take bias binding. And there are videos for doing bias binding. So you're going to want to really, research that, have that in your skill box and ready to go if you want to replace binding. But
I was going to say, so if I say it's just in a little area, right? And you want to match it, replace just a section. At what point would you just remove that entire binding and add a completely new binding in whatever color you want that complements the quilt When would you put that much work into it?
Well, it kind of then depends. Like, is it something my great grandmother made? Is it something I bought at an auction? Um, if it's more than half, then you may as well take off the binding and put new binding on, because it's going to take hours even to stitch to secure. And, there are times when it's just better to preserve it as is and not worry about it and just enjoy the art that's left in it and the value and what that quilter created. So you have to weigh out the use and the time. And if it's something you absolutely love and you want to enjoy it on a bed, then, sit down with a good movie
Or two.
or two or three and take it off. It'll take a little time, but it may be worth it to enjoy it for years to come.
Yep, absolutely. All right. Sandra wants to know, is a 1/4-inch foot accurate? It seems like they can be off a little.
Yep. 1/4-inch feet are a great debate. There are at least 2 different kinds out there that I have used and pretty much I've done away with and just do my own. But everybody has a different security level. Now, there's a 1/4-inch foot out there that has a blade on the side, and it's fairly accurate as long as you don't jam the fabric up into it and then end up with a 3/8 inch seam allowance. It's a guide. It's not supposed to be, curled up against it. So use that. You may want to be able to adjust the needle position on your machine to get that accuracy that you want along with using the blade. Now, that blade is good as long as you're piecing pieces like 2 squares together. But when you start to, run over another seam, it sometimes can cause issues when you're get into other kinds of piecing. There are 1/4-inch foots that just narrow in the front and you follow the front of it. Again, just double check to see where your fabric should be riding. Should your raw edges be peeking out a little from that foot, or should they actually be covered up by the foot? Mm-hmm. So that if you want that, a lot of people will start with those kinds of feet on their machine and eventually may do away with them. And they get comfortable where the 1/4-inch foot is, a 1/4-inch seam allowance is on their machine. Others swear by them and always have them on their machines. So
Yep.
No one right answer there.
Absolutely. I have one on my machine and I use it, but same thing. I think my machine even came with 2 different ones. I love one. I don't like the other. So you kind of, find whichever one works for you, for sure.
Yep.
So, all right. Debbie asks, my mom pieced an approximately 5 foot by 5 foot quilt, but unfortunately got sick and passed before she finished it. I've been sewing my entire life, mostly clothes, but I've never quilted or bound anything. In your opinion, would it be a good or bad first project for me to try finishing her quilt?
I think it would be a lovely thing to finish the quilt because you know what love went into it, what she created. If you have machine skills already, so you know how to sew, we just need to squeeze that seam allowance down to the 1/4-inch. So practice on a few things first, make some small things, get comfortable with that. Maybe it's just going to be simple borders that finish off that quilt to have a little lap quilt to enjoy. When it comes to machine quilting, that's a little bit harder. I mean, it takes a little bit more practice, but if you can find if there's a walking foot that you can just do some simple straight lines or some outline quilting on it, you can easily finish that quilt up. There are absolutely great videos on doing binding, ones here at National Quilt Circle. There's lots of resources to help you get that binding on the quilt. And you can always talk to friends and other quilters, maybe even some of her friends that may assist you through a FaceTime video, or if they have to chat outside your window to get you directly how to do the binding. If there's a will, there's a way to get it done. So, and they might even volunteer to help because, we quilters, we kind of stick together and we like to see our projects get finished even when we're not here anymore. So I would say, yes, you can finish it yourself. See if there's any friends of hers that were quilters who might give you tips and tricks on finishing it up. They would love to help.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Liz asks, I have trouble maintaining a straight seam when joining sections of improv piecing into the larger quilt top. There are often many, many seams, nearly none of which match for nesting, and I typically use a lot of pins to help hold the mini seam allowances facing in the direction to which I have pressed them. I always press both allowances to the dark side, and I try to stop the pinpoint just before the edge of my presser foot. But is there a pinning or pressing technique that I need to change?
Okay. If you're trying to sew those together, I know what you mean. There's a lot of seams, there's a lot going on, and trying to get your seam straight. Um, there is a cheat method, and it's called a marking tool. You can always lay in a line, and I did that early on when I was trying to get my quarter seam accurate, and I had so many things to think about, trying to make sure the seam allowances are going the right direction. Sometimes I would literally just take the ruler and mark from beginning to end and put a dot at the beginning where I wanted to start, a really light line with a fabric marking pen or pencil, and then a dot where I want to stop. And that will help teach your brain how far to stitch before if you want to stitch just a 1/4 inch from the bottom of that block. So that's a great training wheel. And when you're having to think about so many other things, it may help you keep your stitching line nice and straight so that you can deal with the seam allowances and everything else and keep you right on the 1/4 inch where you want to be.
Absolutely. Now, I would say the only thing I would add is the pinning is like, if I'm going to be stitching right up to a pin to where I know I want to take it out, I always put the pin, like if this is my fabric, so the head of the pin is sticking out to the right because I'm right-handed. So it's much easier for me to pull that pin out at the last minute versus, trying to reach around or, so putting it in. I mean, if you're left-handed, obviously put it in the other side, but wherever it's just easiest to get to be able to stitch as close to that pin as absolutely possible.
Yep, exactly.
All right, Gail wants to know, are there grippers to put on the rulers that we already have? I hate to have to go and buy new ones. So if so, where do I find them?
There are, trying to remember all the different names. There is a film that you can put on the back. Over time, it does pick up a lot of dust and needs to be changed out. There are even gripper sprays that you can put onto the back of rulers. Again, over time, they may get a little less tacky and need to be resprayed. So do some research. I know that there, like I said, a film that you can put on the back to help. It helps somewhat. I've used it in the past. It's not as good as the built-in on the ruler, but it does assist you. And that there are some sprays that you can put onto the back of rulers too. So that may assist you until you get to a birthday or a Christmas and you can ask for one for a gift.
Absolutely. They also make long strips, and I can't think of the brand of it either, but long strips that you can put them. They do raise your ruler up just a little bit. So that's the thing is you want to make sure you buy the strip that's as long or longer, and then you can trim it as your ruler. That way you don't have one half of your ruler that's, sinks down when you try to cut. But all right, what is a good long-lasting spray-based?
Oh, I have a favorite, but everybody uses a different kind. Again, and let me see if I can grab it out of my drawer really quick. Now, I didn't get paid for this ad. Sulky's KK2000 is my favorite go-to basting spray. And yes, it comes in a very small bottle, but it goes a long way. I've used others. They're okay, but they seem to become so aerosolized into the air, so many floating around that I'm kind of worried about where it's going. And this one smells probably the least objectionable because some of them have a very strong odor to them. This one, I have probably basted things and let them sit for 6 months and they were still adhered. Now, if I were to pull those layers apart, it may not be as tacky anymore and need to be rebasted, but it held and it washes out. Mm-hmm. Now, I will tell a tale on myself. I did spray baste a quilt on my kitchen table that's oak, and it went off the edge onto the table, and I was like, oh no, I'm in trouble. This is never gonna. It washed off. Good. My kitchen table. My kids have abused it since, but and scratched it and marred it and everything else. But this washed off, so it was a good thing because some can be extremely sticky, and it's hard to remove those products. So this is my favorite, and I buy it not just by the can. I mean, I buy like 3 at a time when the store has them. So.
Yeah. We actually agree on a product. I love it. That is one that I have used as well. I do agree with that. I have never tested out the longevity of it because I'm usually just baste and go, so I don't have to redo it. But perfect. All right, I'm not sure if you're gonna know this next one here, but they did a Thangles 1/2 square triangle swap. Okay, the pieces are all still sitting in a bag. The fabric theme was the same. I just don't know where to start to look for a pattern.
Okay. Well, Thangles is a product that helps you make a half square triangles or triangle squares that are very accurate. The Thangles is put on it's a printed paper that lays on top of strips. It has the sewing lines there, the cutting lines. All you need to do is find out what size those triangle squares finish, and then match that to a pattern in that size, or put them together as is, just triangle squares, and make a quilt with that, or a table runner, depending on how big this project actually is. You're going to find that those triangle squares are very accurate. Removing the paper is quite easy because the paper is very fine and it pulls apart real easily. I've used the product. It does make your piecing look great because, and it was easy to use because it can be done with strips, and cutting strips is easy. So instead of having to cut a big chunk and then, there are triangle squares on a roll, which you drive all over making multiple ones in a big chunk of fabric. Those work fine too. Thangles just happens to work off of strips. It's another method for making the triangle squares. So just look for what size those finish and match that up to a pattern that uses those. Have fun.
Yeah. Perfect. All right. Peggy wants to know which size needle is best to use when putting 100% cotton blocks together.
I usually use a 90-14 needle in my machine, kind of a utility. You can use an 80-12 also. Those are kind of the middle road universal type needles for piecing. Ashley, what do you use?
I was going to say 80. That was the one I was going to go with. So, and it's usually the same thing. I will buy a universal pack that's got, a few 70, a few 80, a few 90. And if you're ever unsure, just pick the one in the middle. I feel like it's a good place to start on pretty much anything. And if you, got to break a needle, bend it, obviously you need to go up a little bit because your needle is too fine or too thin. And if you're leaving really big holes in your fabric or something, then your needle is too big. So I feel like just going with a good middle of the road one's always a good place to start.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. All right. I have a quilt that was made by my great grandmother in the early 1900s. The backing was flour sacks that she dyed with water used to boil black walnut hulls. The quilt was used a lot and is in pretty rough shape. What would be the best way to preserve this quilt? Should it be repaired, which would be extensive, or make something else out of the good parts of it?
That's a good question because repairing it may take a long, it sounds like with a dyed fabric in there, you're going to have a harder time maybe matching something to repair it with. So it may be that it becomes what we can sometimes call a cutter quilt. Make some small keepsake kinds of things out of the remaining portions of the quilt that are good. So it's a wonderful thing to have a piece like that, even if it's a small piece of something that a relative made that far back. That's absolutely wonderful that it's still around. She must have been quite the quilter and quite the ambitious to dye a fabric for the backing and everything. It will be hard to cut up. I would plan what you want to, salvage out of it if you want to cut it up. If it's just making some small type, maybe a pillow fronts out of it, or a table topper, if it's something that can be, used on top of a table, because flour sacks were kind of fun little prints. It really depends on how much time you want to invest in it, because, and it's an act of love to repair an old quilt. And if there's no one to pass it along to, then maybe repairing and keeping it for yourself to use is fine. If there are many people that you would like to share that quilt with, then it's make that cut, dice it up, and share the love a little.
I was just going to say that part. It would be a fun if there's multiple family members involved to be able to give everybody a little piece of it. But I like the term "dice it up." That's a good one. Okay.
It would be hard.
All right. Sherry says, "Hello, first time here. I've just started English paper piecing hexagons. Oh my world, it's addictive." Have you done a lot of English paper piecing? Do you have any tips for either somebody who may be wanting to get into it, or what to do with all of them after you've pieced? Because I know a lot of people do this. They'll make like 100 little hexagons and then never put them together into anything. So like,
There's
what are your suggestions?
Yeah. Should I pull them out and be honest? I started them years ago, and I've made like flower shapes, and then because it was very traditional back then, and now the modern quilters have really taken over and done some fabulous designs with the English paper piecing beyond our imaginations. They've taken it and run so many directions. It is addicting. It's so much fun to look at all the different designs that you can fussy cut out and put in the centers of different hexes and the number of sizes that are available now in the papers for you to work on. So the biggest thing I think with those is to try to keep like a bag or something, a way to stay organized with them so you keep everything together. You know, kind of commit a small pair of scissors, your favorite thimble, if you're using a glue stick, a fabric glue stick with those, and kind of keep everything together so that when you want to take it with you to go, you don't have to go finding everything. That's staying organized is kind of a good thing with those. But yes, I can see how they get to be extremely addicting. Yeah. Like I said, I need to sit down at some point and just figure out something to make with them, because hours and hours were spent either flying, sitting in an airport, sitting in the car waiting for kids from ball games, volleyball, wrestling tournaments, making those pieces. And so I need to spur my interest, my enthusiasm to finish it too. So.
I feel like we started this whole thing talking about, resolutions, getting things done. I think you need to add that to the list. I have to say, I don't have a whole lot of like works in progress either. I try to, start one and finish up right away, but I do have an English paper piecing one that I started a couple years ago. My excuse, however, is that I now have 2 small children who that's all they want to do is play with them. And I've lost, I think, as many pieces as I've made. So I need to wait until they grow up and then I'll finish it. All right. Our next one here. I've tried to use up scraps by making disappearing 9 patches. How fun. Now, is there a pattern to use them?
Okay. That could be almost endless. Once you get your disappearing 9 patches made, there you could put it in just straight lines. It could be a row quilt. It could be put on point. You can add multiple kinds of sashing. So now is your time to spend an hour or two searching through images online to find one maybe that really attracts you, because it's kind of endless, the things you could do with them. Because the sashing could be simple. It could be pieced. You could have fancy cornerstones, and it will make a completely different design when you arrange them with sashing or putting them on point. So you're just at the beginning of the fun.
I think so. And I think it's definitely something where you can play around and have all of the same blocks made and then make a completely different quilt every single time. So
yeah. And maybe this is a series of quilts. Maybe you get so addicted to the disappearing 9, you end up making a series of 3 or 4, and they're all going to look different.
Yeah, so, absolutely. All right. I've tried triangles and gave up. I can do lots with using squares and rectangles, but I am scared of those points for triangles. So what are some tips for not being scared of triangles, practicing those and using them in future designs?
Okay. Triangles can be daunting if you actually cut your pieces into triangles at the very beginning. So my tip is start with squares, learn the 2 at a time method. If you're going to be creating a 2 fabric quilt, a 2 color quilt, and you're going to make multiple triangles in the same color combination, Google 8 at a time triangle squares. Because in those processes, you're only going to be working with cutting squares. You're going to mark your stitching lines, you're going to mark your cutting lines, and then you're going to press. That means that you don't have as much of a chance to distort the triangle shapes or the diagonals as when you cut an actual triangle. That bias can stretch and stretch as you feed it into the machine, as you handle it, getting it from your cutting to the sewing machine even. So there's a lot of chance for distortion. So try the multiple 2 at a time, 8 at a time methods. You may find that you have better results. Now, the one thing you can do before you even get started with that is to pick up either a best press kind of product, light spray starch, even a traditional spray starch, something that if your fabric has a lot of give to it and you're afraid of distorting that diagonal seam, is to press your fabric with spray starch first. That helps it kind of temporarily hold the fibers in the weave a little bit tighter together. Then do the right sides together, the two fabrics, do your marking for your 2 at a time method or your 8 at a time method, and then the pressing as you open up those triangle squares to press seams to one direction. You may find those to be some tips. Spray starch, multiple pieces at a time, or the last trick you can always have in your tools is to oversize and trim down. Now, if you don't like trimming and you don't like cutting, that might not be your favorite method, but it may help you. Say for instance, I was even speaking with a quilter over the phone this last week, and she said, I hate the ones I've had to cut that are, what was the number she was doing? 2 3/8. She goes, I can't even find the 8th mark on my ruler decent to see it, to make my triangle squares come out the right size. And so I suggested cutting the squares 2 1/2, which is 1/8 bigger. We're not wasting a lot of fabric, just a tiny bit larger. Then do the method it was called for in her pattern. Then cut them apart and press, and then go back and trim just a tiny bit so that your triangle squares are nice and even. Because that process of piecing and pressing can cause a little bit of a distortion. And that's where people tend to get into trouble. And if you can trim it down to kind of take the sweet spot out of the middle, then you get the accuracy you need and your piecing will be more smooth. Yeah. So hopefully those can help.
Absolutely. I'm a huge fan of trimming, not necessarily the act of doing it, but like what it looks like when it's done. I'm a huge fan of that.
Yep. All right. You can listen to some good music while you're trimming so that it goes by really quickly and you don't realize what you've done.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Heather asks, I'm currently working on 2 different patterns, Alaska by Laundry Basket and Out of Bounds by Christopher Florence. I find Out of Bounds very easy as long as you follow the pattern step by step. However, Alaska has been the opposite and has been a deep challenge. Both are rated the same, but are definitely not. How are patterns rated, and is there a consistent level? It's hard to know if this is a challenge or a comfortable quilt.
Yeah, if they're things coming from 2 different designers and 2 different companies, there really isn't a standard. There isn't a set mold or template that we use to grade out a difficulty of quilt or how a quilt pattern is actually written. So you will find that there are going to be some that are easier to follow, others that are more difficult to follow, and there's not a whole lot that can be done about that. Tend to go then towards the companies you like, the way their patterns are written, and support them. If you're having issues with a pattern, it might be that you have to read the pattern ahead, sleep on it overnight and think about it, and then figure out or collaborate with another quilter. Ask them, have you done this method? Do you understand exactly what the instructions are trying to tell me to do in this instance? Because pretty much anybody can sit down and type out a pattern and draw pictures and call it a pattern. So there's not like any clearinghouse that says, now this is ready to be published. And so everybody has a different approach. I think when I go to purchase a pattern, I am, of course, drawn to the design, but my test, if you can at all, is to look at the instructions before you purchase, even if it's just a look into like one page. If it is extremely wordy, if it's long paragraphs, I'm sorry to those quilters who are going to be like, well, I write mine that way, but I tend to get lost in long paragraphs. I want the verb and the noun and not too much more, because I need to know what action to take. what to cut, what to put together. But, the process in the middle of how I carry it to here and there, that's personal. That's
Yep.
editorializing. And usually when you look at those patterns that you like, they are more cut and dry. They're giving you the specifics of what to cut in what order. And then,
Mhm.
it's a construction bullet point down. It's not long paragraphs.
Yep.
Maybe that comes from having worked I worked for a quilt magazine. I was not a writer. I was not a pattern designer, but I had to read a lot of patterns.
Mhm.
So, and test a lot of patterns. And when I got lost in paragraphs, that was where usually it was like, yeah, way too much, cut this down, and writers there were always good about keeping it brief and to the point. So, but that one that you really love and it's giving you trouble, find a good quilt friend to help you muddle through it and
Yeah.
finish, because there's a reason why you liked it. So let's finish.
Exactly. And you want to finish it for sure. So that goes perfectly into our last question here. Peggy asks, is it normal to have many quilt projects that are just put away and avoided? I have many. Yikes.
Oh, there are. You are definitely normal. You're in the normal range. I would say if for those goals for the year is to pull out one and try to finish one, or make the decision. We discussed that in resolutions. If it's something that you have fallen out of love with, it's okay to let it go. Pass it to another quilter, to a friend. If it's just too far gone, just let it go, period. But it's okay to have changed your mind on colors and technique, or I've gotten so much better since I started this. What was I thinking? Cut it up and make it into pot holders.
Or those are the perfect, if it's just a quilt top you haven't finished, we talked about practicing. We talked about practicing the quilting, not being afraid of ruining something. It could be the perfect thing for that.
It's your good practice one. And it might be the quilt that you practice on and then you bind, because you also should practice your binding.
Mhm.
And then it goes in the trunk of your car for a snowstorm, which we are headed into today in Iowa. Because my dad always said you needed to have a blanket in the car.
Perfect. Perfect. I love it. See, so there's many muses for any of the quilts that you're going to finish, for sure. All right, and I'm just going to remind everyone that if there is, a quilt you don't have a project you're working on and you want a free pattern, to click on the banner on the screen and it'll take you to the free patterns page on National Quilters Circle, and there is quite a few different free patterns that you can pick from, play around with, and make, of course, and finish, of course. And then join us back here next month, and we'll have another Q&A session with Colleen.
Bye, everybody.